The United States of America is one of the greatest superpowers of the world. It may be even considered the only remaining superpower for now and a long time to come. The US has not only affected itself, but rather helped reshape the world. In order for the US to reach this greatness, a set of historical events had to take place, one of which is the Civil War, which was fueled by the persistence of slavery and discrimination against the southern states. Over 600,000 soldiers died during this war. President Lincoln and fellow Republicans declared that they would not oppose the Civil War and swore not to commence it. The war led to the destruction of infrastructure, and it was one of the earliest industrial wars. It ended in 1865. After that, the freed slaves joined the Union Army, and President Lincoln supported the Emancipation Proclamation. He further led the Congress in voting for the 13th Amendment that assured that the emancipation was universally accepted and permanent. This marked the end of slavery and the beginning of a new era of freedom. Later, the freed slaves had access to the same resources of fellow citizens. However, it took the US hundreds of years in order to treat all citizens equally with no discrimination. Further along the years, the US was faced with a huge dilemma, which was the interwar period, which is the period between the World War I and the World War II. This period was characterized by economic depression and the rise of fascism. In America, the first half of the interwar period was referred to as the Roar. This is because it was a period of prosperity.
There were many new inventions during this time period. These included the automobile, the refrigerator, the radio, the vacuum, and the telephone.
Although this changed from 1929 with the onset of the Great Depression, Roosevelt was expanding the Monroe Doctrine, which allowed America to use force in liberating the Latin American countries. Although America was reluctant to join the war, it reached a point that failing to join could have meant losing supremacy. There were three main reasons that forced the US to join the war. The first was that a ship carrying some Americans was sunk, and the second was the interception of the Zimmerman telegram. And the final reason was that the US had economic ties to the European countries. America helped in the establishment of the League of Nations, but failed to join. And despite the huge economic challenges, there was still some hope that global peace and stability could be maintained. After the chaos that loomed over the world during this period of time, Roosevelt wanted to design a new monetary system which operates under strict rules in order to avoid what resulted from leaving the market to regulate its own. At that point of time, the US was finally ready to act as a superpower and take responsibility. So they decided to form the United Nations, as well as the Bretton Woods monetary system.
The Bretton Woods Conference was the major conference to set up the post-war international economic system, and it was dominated by two personalities, one from the United States in the form of Harry Dexter White, a Treasury official, and the British side by John Maynard Keynes, the great economist.
As for the World Bank, its role was to lend money to needed countries to help them reconstruct and develop after the war. The Bretton Woods system puts the US dollar at the center of trading. With its boundaries, the US guaranteed to exchange any amount of dollars for gold. However, the situation did not last long and the system proved failure. That's when what is known by the Nixon shock happened. The US was no longer able to exchange gold for dollars, and Nixon stopped the exchange process and imposed 10% tariffs on all US imported goods, disregarding the GATT agreement.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
If it wasn't for the Bretton Woods system, Robert Triffin would have not discovered the major flaw that eventually caused the whole system to come down crashing. In 1960, Triffin testified before the United States Congress, warning for serious flaws with the Bretton Woods system. His theory was based on the accumulation of the United States dollars outside of the US. He knew that on the long term, this would erode confidence in the dollar. He predicted that the system would not maintain both liquidity and confidence, a theory later to be known as the Triffin dilemma. His idea was largely ignored until 1971, when his hypothesis became reality, forcing US President Richard Nixon to stop the convertibility of US dollar into gold. And with that, the Bretton Woods system ended. Special drawing rights were created by the IMF in 1969 and were intended to be an asset held in foreign exchange reserves under the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rate. But after the collapse of the system, the SDR has taken on a far less important role. The IMF itself calls the current role of the SDR insignificant. Developed countries who hold the greatest number of SDRs are unlikely to use them for any purpose. The only actual users of SDRs may be developing countries. All of this did not affect the importance of the US dollar, as it remains the main currency being used today, even after a new international currency banker was introduced between central banks. This is mainly due to the US having the highest consumer market in the world. Many of the world countries are selling their goods in the US market, which means they have to buy dollars in order to be able to enter and trade in the market. Due to the fact that the US is a major consumer market, it will still remain a major power in the world economy, but this time not because it has the money and gold, but because everyone wants to invest in its market. This sort of market somehow guarantees a stable demand for US dollars, which is very good for the currency. Not only countries are interested in entering the US market, but foreign companies and businessmen want to make money from such a thriving consumer market. This helps the US dollar grow in power and also make it an unofficial world currency due to its high demand all across the world. While it's clear that the US had great influence in the world for the past 150 years economically, its political role was equally effective, and that was evident through the doctrines of each president of the United States.
Presidential doctrine comprises the key goals and attitudes for United States for foreign affairs. Each doctrine represents the political, economical, and social ideas of its president. A common element about all doctrines is that they are all to serve the American interests and protect the US while spreading its ideology and beliefs. The first presidential doctrine was the Monroe Doctrine. It was against colonization and intervention and aimed at protecting the US national security. The doctrine of Woodrow Wilson was evolved in an ambitious foreign policy. He drew upon several durable traditions in the US foreign relations. Wilson's foreign policy was unique in its own right. He advocated the spreading of democracy, the opening of global markets, the creation of an international organization dedicated to keeping peace, and an active global role for the United States. The dispatch of troops to Mexico and Haiti reflected these goals, but it was through entry into World War I that Wilsonianism reached its high point. Truman Doctrine was an international relations policy, which stated that the US would support Greece and Turkey with economic and military aid to prevent them from falling into the hands of Soviets. Truman pledged the US to contain in Europe and elsewhere and impelled the US support to any nation with both its military and economic aid if its stability was threatened by communism or the Soviet Union. The Kennedy Doctrine was mainly aimed towards Latin America during his term in office between 1961 and 1963. Kennedy voiced support for the containment of communism and the reversal of communist progress in the Western Hemisphere. Kennedy's doctrine was focused on the expansion of the foreign policy. Nixon's doctrine reflected concerns about the reliance foreign allies on the United States in conflicts. This strategy allowed Nixon to devise a way for the United States to exit that unpopular conflict. The doctrine also states that the US would come to the aid of its allies in time of need while insisting that the bulk of the responsibility for fighting these conflicts would fall on the afflicted country itself. The doctrine also helped open diplomatic talks with China and other communist countries. Reagan doctrine sought to achieve peace through strength. During his 2 terms, Reagan increased defense spending but sought to improve relations with the Soviet Union. Overall, the Reagan years saw a restoration of prosperity, and the goal of peace through strength seemed to be within grasp. As for Bush, he believed in unilateralism, violence, and wars. Initially, the Bush administration embraced cooperation with other nations, but that diminished with time. He chose to act unilateral when necessary. This was evident after a 9/11 terror attack, which led to the USA invasion of Afghanistan. Finally, Obama's doctrine embraces multilateralism, soft power, and non-violence. His foreign policies embraces the contribution of other nations. He notes that America needs to approach the rest of the international community as an equal and not as a supreme nation. He believes in the need for soft power, such as utilizing summits and foreign aid to attain its goals. With every doctrine, the US managed to affect the world and most importantly serves its own.